Okay, what is your name?
My name is Alan Arive.
Okay, what has made you, or what has inspired you to be a filmmaker?
Well, I was originally involved in theater. I was an undergraduate at Northwestern University about 20-some years ago now. Acting, I got involved in writing plays. I started putting on some of my own one-acts in theaters in Chicago. And when I graduated, I really had formed the idea that I wanted to at least act in films. So I drove off to Los Angeles, 2,000 miles away, and I immediately got the sense that I would have some control if I made my own films as opposed to just auditioning and acting for others. I did act for others. You know, I'm in the Screen Actors Guild, and I followed the dream of hopefully getting in larger and larger roles, but I became more and more interested in having control over what the film was about. And, you know, writing it and directing it gives you that kind of control.
Okay. Now, what is the hardest thing about being a filmmaker, especially for independent filmmaking?
Well, the most frustrating thing is usually the lack of funding. Filmmaking is something that rarely costs nothing unless your idea is based around only what you have, sort of like Rodriguez having a guitar and a turtle and the use of part of a main street to do El Mariachi or something like that. If you're not designing it to be as low budget as possible, you're usually challenged by having to come up with the budget. So on some level, that's the hardest thing. Of course, coming up with a good idea, realizing it the way you really want it to be on the page so that other people can understand it, finding the right people to fulfill different needs of production, like who's going to shoot the film, who's going to help design the look of the film as it's shot with the camera, who's going to design, finding the right actors. I mean, it's the kind of thing where everything's got to mesh to some degree, or one element can seem lacking and undermine the whole production.
Okay. Now, what is the difference between independent and Hollywood movies, though, and making them? What's the difference between those two?
Well, the classic difference is that a pre-existing group, usually some version of a studio, even though we're not in the studio era anymore, there are studios and there are branches of studios and collaborations between former studios, so that they already have a certain budget for a certain amount of films available, and they choose which films they think are good investments. So, you know, Hollywood filmmaking is usually about, yes, people taking pride in their work, yes, sometimes creating what they would consider to be art, usually with a dose of entertainment involved. But first and foremost, the studios, or the what exists now as a sort of remnant of the studios, are concerned with it being a good investment financially. So that would be probably the main difference. Independent film usually comes from a desire to make films, not necessarily make money, although people hope that that's the result. They often make things that, if they were able to stand outside the situation and get some perspective, would quite obviously not be the first choice simply to make money, right? So funding independent films, crewing independent films, casting independent films is all sort of challenged by the lack of Hollywood-level funding. Now, there are independent productions, technically independent productions, which really aren't. Numerous studios have independent, sort of copycat independent branches, right? So they will make something that's under one of their sort of splinter group production companies, but it's really got the resources on some level and support of a studio. So a truly independent film is really not connected in with any studio, and you're making the film as a speculative venture, hoping someone will want to pick it up in some form of distribution. Whereas a Hollywood production, the machine or the infrastructure of distribution already exists. So, if they're casting Brad Pitt in the next zombie attack movie, which I guess he's in right now, they already know that they have a certain amount of theaters that they're going to release the film in. They've made deals with often branches of theater chains that they have some hand in if they're outside of the United States, and so it's a done deal concerning the promotion. Now, not all Hollywood productions make money, right? Because sometimes they just don't appeal to an audience. That's the ultimate test. Will people go to the theater?
Okay. Now, you said about distributing. Now, how? Now, I don't know if that's a question I read, but I was going to ask, like, how do independent movies get their film distributed? Like, what is the process of going through to get it distributed? Besides going to film festivals, but get it to more wider, ranges.
Well, the answer to that is so varied that it's almost impossible to just bring into one statement. But well, you mentioned film festivals. Usually, that is one level of distribution. It's hard to get an independent film into a movie theater at the mall, right? Because, as I mentioned before, there are already agreements between studios and studio-like entities to get films distributed through the conventional venues, right? So if you don't have the ability to get your film shown at the mall, or even an art house, independent theater, one of the ways you're getting an audience to see your film on the big screen, at least, is at film festivals. So even though it costs money to submit films to film festivals, some filmmakers will continue doing it after they've won some awards and done well, simply because they want a wider audience. Beyond that, well, let me just say, it's very difficult to sell a single short film. It's not impossible. Sometimes winners of certain film festivals will be put on a channel that's sponsored by the festival. I guess the most famous would be the Sundance Channel, which is sponsored by the festival, and the Institute in Utah. But you're hoping to get picked up as one part of a group showing or screening on at least the small screen. If that's not the case, a lot of people try to self-distribute. They'll put things online. Maybe they don't even worry about making money and they put it on Vimeo or YouTube. But I know a few filmmakers, for instance, who have a group of short films and they've gotten enough signatures to satisfy Netflix and their interest in knowing there's an audience out there. They've gotten enough signatures to get an hour's worth of material, which is what the requirement of Netflix, for instance. Within that sort of overall distribution model, a lot of the times you want to, as an independent filmmaker, tap into existing opportunities as opposed to create them from scratch. If you're making a feature film, then an independent film could be Little Miss Sunshine, right? That was made. They didn't know if anybody would buy it. It did very well at Sundance, and it was bought, and then it was distributed by basically by the studio system, right? They had decided this is a good investment. We think a certain amount of people will watch this, and it had smaller distribution than something like, I don't know, a Tom Cruise movie would have, but it had fairly wide distribution, and you could go see it in some malls. You could go see it at some art house movie theaters. So there's that middle ground where you could make something that might have the potential to make money, might have a few stars in it, but it's technically independent, and it might get picked up at one of the more famous film festivals for distribution. So there's every level. You can go all the way from handing out DVDs to your friends to making something that might tap into some of the resources of the studio system.
Okay. Now, for your actors, let's say like if your actors are in the film, do they get paid for it? Like if the films like do good, they get paid for it.
Yeah, that's there is many levels of pay for actors as there are levels of independent film up through into studio system. productions. Usually a very low budget independent film is not even casting actors who are in unions, right? Or if they are, the actors are agreeing to ignore the fact that they're in unions and simply not mention it until it's brought up. Sometimes actors will get caught for acting in non-union films if they're members of the Screen Actors Guild or AFTRA or some other union. But usually the very lowest budget productions are not using union actors, and everyone understands they're probably never getting paid. Above that, there are low budget agreements with the Screen Actors Guild, and now with the combined union of Screen Actors Guild and AFTRA, so that you can initially use actors without paying them. But the caveat is, if you end up making money, then you will move into a new level of agreement with the Screen Actors Guild, for instance, and have to pay some money to the actors. And then if you make more, maybe you're paying full daily wages, etc. So there are ways of working with seasoned actors who are already in unions through low-budget agreements that the Screen Actors Guild and AFTRA put together for those situations. They're often criticized, these low-budget contracts, because they still assume that the filmmaker will make most of their money through theatrical distribution. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a miniature model of what occurs with studio system productions. And of course, that's probably not where any money will be made by a very low-budget independent producer / director. The money would be made through DVDs, Blu-ray, streaming, some distribution through television, and the kind of channel that I was mentioning earlier, like Sundance Channel, and that's when it gets to be a difficult situation for an independent filmmaker, because they end up having to pay large percentages of their profit in royalties to the union actors. So there are many cases where you would be making the film for the love of it and managing profits only to hand them off to your actors.
Okay. Now, as a director, have you got paid for any films? Like, have you got paid?
I have been paid small amounts. I've worked into the budget that I would be paid, for instance, a certain amount so that I don't put my family in jeopardy, for instance, by the end of the production. Okay. But I often supplied some of the funding to begin with, so it's hard to say if I actually made anything. As a producer, I made a small amount on a film called Park Day, which was made in Springfield, Missouri, by a bunch of people from Los Angeles, but the director was from Springfield, and I was one of the producers on that. Ultimately, because of giving up my schedule as a commercial actor when I left to produce this film out of the Los Angeles area, I probably lost money, but on paper I made money. I think the most money I've made from making films is being hired as a professor both at Missouri Western State before I taught here and here at the University of Mississippi, because that was one of the first considerations. Does the person have a finished work that has had some recognition at film festivals, gotten official selections and won some awards? And the answer was yes with one of my films, and I think that's one of the reasons I got the job. So I guess on some level, that would be some indirect pay for making films, for me.
Okay. Now, how does the independent film movies can impact Oxford? Like, does it have an effect on Oxford, like around town, for independent movies?
I don't know how much effect it has on general society. Those people who are already interested in the arts, for instance, who already involve themselves in events at the Yoknapatawpha Arts Council / Powerhouse, those people would be affected. They would understand possibly more about how films are made through the Q&A sessions after screenings. They may decide that they now need to make movies themselves because other people who are not big budget Hollywood moguls are making films, right? So there's a certain percentage of the Oxford community who would be affected directly by understanding that there are opportunities out there now. For instance, there's Ox Film, which was formed last year to inform would-be filmmakers as to how they would actually get into production. How do you write a screenplay? How do you prepare that screenplay for production through pre-production materials? How do you distribute after you've actually shot the film, etc.? You could learn these kinds of things through workshops at Ox Film if you weren't already a film related student here at the university. There is also the Oxford Film Festival, which is actually quite well known now. People come from out of town, from cities all over the United States, and even some from Europe to be involved in the Oxford Film Festival, and they have sort of workshops and events as well connected to the festival. So these kinds of things have grown over the years and are influencing the Oxford community on a greater level, sort of incrementally each year. I would say that some groups that aren't interested in making film would be influenced by, especially documentaries. For instance, we have media and documentary projects here on campus headed up by Andy Harper, and we have a professor here who teaches editing who is actually from media and documentary projects named Matthew Graves, who's working on a William Winters documentary right now. He also, as part of the 50th anniversary of James Meredith becoming a student at Ole Miss, he did a documentary on the turmoil that occurred as James Meredith entered the student population as the first African-American student at the University of Mississippi, and also the results in the years following. So that showed on PBS, it showed at film festivals, it showed right here on campus to actually large crowds, and I know that I wasn't aware of exactly what the events around the James Meredith sort of incidents were, and I was highly appreciative of being informed through those through his documentaries. So I would say that, especially just as a viewer, you might have there might be some impact just in viewing documentaries and some fictional films made by people here on campus and in Oxford.
Okay, now what was the greatest independent film ever made? Which was the greatest independent film that was successful, ever made?
Oh gosh,
greatest one that achieved success.
That would be an extremely difficult thing to identify. In the earlier days when the word independent or indie first started being used, quite obvious independent films like Clerks, or I don't know, even things that started verging on partnering up with people who sometimes worked with the studio system, like My Own Private Idaho or something. These films were quite obviously successes in the independent film world, but now the line is so blurred. I mean, you might have Johnny Depp act in Pirates of the Caribbean movie and turn right around and act in a lower budget movie that's technically independent but has the support of his contacts and other producing entities that he would normally be connected with. So it's so difficult. I would say it's almost impossible to say what the most successful independent film is at this point in history. Things are very difficult to identify as being purely independent or not. I would say that there are some things that are so independent, like the films made in the 90s around the Dogma 95 movement from Denmark, that required no use of effects, no use of guns, no use of artificial lighting, no costumes that weren't owned by the actors. Now, on some level, to me, that's a great success, because there were some very successful films, I guess the most successful being a film by Thomas Vinterberg called, well, it's translated as The Celebration. That film won awards at so many festivals. It was, almost unbelievable, considering that it was shot on home video cameras, and had no budget whatsoever. So was that the most successful, or is success only defined by rivaling a Hollywood production in the box office returns? I don't know. So my answer is it's very difficult to say what the most successful independent movie would be. Just as though I would say it's almost impossible to say what the most successful studio picture ever was. I don't think anyone would only base things on the box office. It would probably be a combination of popularity, impact on audiences, impact on filmmakers after that film was released. It's a very difficult call. Usually different organizations have different criteria to narrow the idea of what success is. And I'm not an organization that narrows that down.
Okay, last question. Okay, last question before we end this. Okay, now I know what independent stuff means, but I'm saying, like, how can a independent movie be better? Like, how can independence be better?
So, in what way might independence have the edge over studio
like
pictures?
for all filmmakers who are independently? How can it be done to be better though?
Oh, how could one
yes.
be better as an independent filmmaker?
Yeah, like how
first,
things.
Okay.
Well,
First, I thought you were asking me in what way might independent films have the potential to be better than studio pictures.
Well, yeah, like,
and I would like to answer that on some level. You know, sometimes it's refreshing to start watching a film and not immediately identify a movie star, because a movie star brings a whole, slew of baggage with him or her due to the other projects they've been in, how they've been marketed in popular magazines, online, through promoting projects overseas. George Clooney is first and foremost, for instance, George Clooney, right?
I see that.
And even I would say, not that George Clooney's not a good actor, but let's say Denzel Washington. On some level, he's Denzel Washington first and foremost. Despite the fact that he's put in some incredible performances, he's a movie star. Sometimes he's just in an action picture, and he is a big box office draw, as is Clooney, as is, even very, legit actors like Meryl Streep. They're movie stars to a great degree. They're simply movie stars. So when I watch a film in which I can't identify any of the actors, to me, in a way, they're the characters, right? Also, if you aren't sinking a large budget investment into the film, then there's not the same need for returns. So you don't have to appeal to the broadest common denominator. For instance, it's popular either myth or demographic research that the biggest demographic is male viewers of films 25 and under. And so, of course, they try to understand, well, what do males 25 and under want? It often involves some violence. It involves maybe the objectification of women, famous, beautiful women. It might involve major challenges, often physical challenges that end positively on some level. Well, an independent film does not have to appeal to males 25 and under. They could appeal to a sort of niche demographic, right? Woody Allen appeals probably to a somewhat older crowd, people who would relate to urban life, who possibly would accept the idea that one goes to a therapist and is searching for the meaning of their life. They would understand culture as it's defined by New York, combined with Europe. Really, we're not talking about a very large crowd, but that kind of film could appeal to a niche crowd, right? And when you get down to real independent filmmaking, which Woody Allen really isn't, you might be appealing to an even smaller niche crowd, some sort of slice of society that has very particular tastes or understanding of things, right? So that's the freedom of an independent film. You do not need to appeal to the largest movie-going demographic, or the second largest, or whatever research in Hollywood has concluded. You might make a film with no idea of appealing to any particular demographic, only because you think it's a great story, and hopefully it appeals to a wide enough audience so you can make your second film or your third or wherever you are in your career.
Well, okay, Mr. Riviere, thank you for your time, and I appreciate the interview. Thank you.
All right, thanks.